Hey guys, welcome back to Critical Flick. Today I'm reviewing Madam Web. So Madam Web is the newest film in the Sony Spider-Man universe, and I had seen a lot of negative feedback about this movie, seen a lot of negative reviews. I tried to go in with a positive mindset like I always do with films, but I have to say, this one really did live up to the negative reputation it has. Right off the bat, we were introduced to Dakota Johnson, who plays the main character, and she is an entirely unlikable character for kind of the beginning of the film. There's a moment early on in the film where even though she is a first responder, she's someone who's trying to save people's lives, she seems like she could care less about people. She's a very closed person because of her family history, but it's so strange seeing her play such an off-putting person. Obviously, they try to explain that a little bit later on in the film, but the movie is pretty heavy-handed with that, particularly in the beginning of the movie. That being said, this movie is pretty heavy-handed with like everything it does in it, so I can't knock it too much just for that, but it was just so strange seeing her be like overly mean to this like little kid in the beginning of the movie. I don't know, it's just something that rubbed me the wrong way when I watched it. And I think part of the heavy-handedness of the film has to do with the dialogue. It has some very clunky dialogue. It has some of the worst dialogue I've seen in a superhero film, and that's saying something because we haven't gotten really phenomenal superhero movies in a while now, I feel. And as far as the story goes, we're following Dakota Johnson's character, Madam Web, and how she's discovering her powers. And like I said, she's a first responder, and she ends up being thrown into some water where she drowns and she technically dies, where she kind of unlocks her power. She's seeing these threads, her ability to kind of follow time, being able to see in the future and change things, and kind of that opens up her idea of who is she. She's trying to discover her past. Her mother was a researcher who was in the Amazon, who was tracking down a spider who had magical powers. There's, these people that live in the Amazon forest, this tribe that are like spider people, and that, the CGI when those spider people first arrived was really horrible, and they show it again later in the film, and I don't know why you'd replay that again. They replay that entire sequence. That's something that this movie does a lot. It has to do with the nature of the character and of her powers, but it's constantly replaying the same scenes over and over and over again to show like her visions and her trying to change things, but it gets so repetitive and so obnoxious at times that it makes the movie feel kind of muddled. It makes it feel longer even than it is. It's almost 2 hours long, but I did feel like it felt longer because of that pacing issue of having these retreads of seeing flashbacks and flash forwards, and I don't know, I could have done without having that every single time any kind of action sequence was going to happen. Oh, I will say right now before I go any further, there will be some spoilers in this review, so if you don't want to know anything about the movie, I would click off now, because I feel like to fully assess this film and talk about some of the negatives and some positives in it, I have to really go into some of the events that take place and choices they decided when writing these characters and writing the story. And one of the big negatives of this movie has something to do with its marketing. It really marketed itself as a movie that was going to have these spider girls, seeing the girls in their costumes, using their powers, and seeing kind of that cool dynamic. We don't really get that in this movie at all. There's two flash forward scenes that take place that show them using their powers, and those were kind of cool scenes. I wouldn't have minded having more of that. I don't think we're going to get a sequel to this movie. I don't know if moving forward we're going to actually get these characters like fully fleshed out in a film because of how poorly received this movie is. But I would have loved to have more of that and maybe an opportunity to see that, because this would have been more fun. This movie feels, like I said, a little longer than it needs to be, and at times, dare I say, it's a little bit boring. I don't like to use boring or lazy as a criticism in a film because a lot of work goes into these films, and I think, there's a lot more things to nitpick other than the pacing of a movie. But at this time, I think it's something that really hurts the movie. The movie already didn't have a lot going for it, and having its style of editing just makes it so much worse. And speaking of the editing, right off the bat where we have a scene taking place in the Amazon forest where we're seeing our villain kind of first show his true colors of how bad a guy he is, it has this weird camera thing where it like zooms in and out and just in these action sequences, and it looks like the person operating the camera like doesn't know how to use the camera. I know it's a deliberate choice, but watching it happen, I know I appreciate they took a risk to try and make maybe the scenes look more dynamic, but it looks silly. It looks like we're watching a handy cam, like zoom in and out while they're like things are happening. It immediately struck me as like, I looked over the people I was watching the film with, and we were all like, why is it doing that? Why are they filming the movie like that? It may be a little nitpicky. I know it's a little bit of a nitpick, but for me, it really just shows a constant lack of care and quality when they were making this film, in my opinion. And speaking of the villain, I have to say that was probably one of my biggest negatives of the film, just besides the overall structure and dialogue, was the villain himself. Ezekiel Sims is just a one-note bad guy. It never really dives too much into who he is or why he's doing what he's doing. We assume he has some really large corporation because he's incredibly rich, and because he stole this spider, he has these powers and he's able to make a lot of money from the spider, and he's obsessed with not dying. He can see these visions of the future, and the girl's killing him, so he's trying to track them down. That's the main conflict of the film. But with that, he doesn't do anything, and a lot of his dialogue was like 80 yard in, or it felt like they recorded it after the fact, and they never really focus on his mouth when he's talking, and it's just strange. A lot of the choices whenever he was on screen, it just felt like it took me out of the movie. I never really wanted him to be on screen at any given time, and his costume is very reminiscent of Spider-Man, which is fine. I think that's something this movie is constantly trying to do, is like go right up to the edge of being like, oh, this is a Spider-Man movie. This is like Spider-Man has to do with this, without ever expressingly do that. And there's some other moments involving the Parker family and everything that goes along with that, with Ben being in this film, where it wants to say that it's Peter Parker. It wants to say that this is Spider-Man being born, and it just never does it. And it even says, with great power comes great responsibility. They kind of twist that on its head a couple times in the film. And it's just so on the nose. And knowing that this movie really probably isn't going to go anywhere, it felt like such a silly inclusion, in my opinion. And I feel like that's enough negativity about this movie, because I will say there are some positive aspects to it. I don't think it was all bad. I think that some of the performances, while the dialogue was bad, were serviceable. I think the relationship between the girls and Madam Web does grow, and it feels like we're watching someone really kind of come full circle of hating family to becoming a family, and I like those moments. I like the dynamics back and forth between the girls and coming together as a family. It reminded me very much of other superhero films and other movies that have that focus. So I liked it. It's a tried and true formula of the idea of family and love and working together to stop evil. So I did like that. But too far in between those themes are just like nonsensical dialogue, nonsensical action scenes. The last big action scene takes place in a fireworks factory that blew up earlier in the film, or there was an event earlier in the film, and it's so strange they go back there and no one did anything about it. And her whole plan was just insane for the way that it ends the movie, for it to be like the villain dying the way he did, which, spoiler, is from a giant Pepsi sign falling on him. And there's these almost like crazy needle drop moments where Madam Web 2 times runs over the villain with a vehicle, and it's just insane. She's like flying into a diner one time with a taxi. She's flying out of a billboard with an ambulance into him, and it's so ridiculous that you can never take the movie seriously. And I almost would have appreciated leaning more into that. I felt like in other movies of this quality, it knows that it's kind of a bad movie and it's kind of silly. This movie never feels like it thinks it's silly. It feels like it's trying to be serious, and whenever it interjects any semblance of kind of comedy, it fell flat for me every single time. And that has a lot, like I said, to do with the dialogue and the writing. So overall, if I were to rate Madam Web, I would give it a 2 out of 10. One of the worst films that I've seen this year. I've seen a lot of not great movies this year. I haven't reviewed as many movies as I've seen because I don't love bashing on movies. I don't love coming in here and being like, oh, this movie's terrible, look how bad this is, because there's a lot of work that goes into it, and I do understand that, sometimes things just don't work out, and maybe it's not for me. So I would love to hear people's opinions that maybe enjoyed this movie. I always love to hear people that really liked a movie that I really didn't like, because maybe you can shed some light on what you enjoyed about it. Also, I know pretty much nothing about the Madam Web character from the comics. I did collect comics. I'm a pretty big Spider-Man fan, but like going into like kind of these tertiary characters like Madam Web, I don't know a lot about them. So her powers, to me, they seemed kind of silly. Obviously, they would grow moving forward. She kind of gets to use them a little bit more by the end of the film. But again, if you liked this movie especially, let me know what you thought. And again, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and see you guys next time.